In this gospel today, we see the apostles in a very difficult situation. Jesus has sent them across the Sea of Galilee to prepare for the next mission. But a strong headwind begins to blow. The boat is tossed about in the waves, which are crashing over the side of the boat. It's also night out, pitch dark really, and the going is tough. When they see Jesus approaching and think that it's a ghost, they become afraid. And Peter says, as we heard, "If it is you, Lord, command me to come to you on the water." And he steps out of the boat into the water. But the winds are strong, and he becomes afraid again. His faith falters, and he begins to sink. He cries out again, "Lord, save me." This story, I think, is analogous to much of our life experiences. So when have you been in a difficult situation where the headwinds were strong against you, you felt like you were being tossed about by waves of difficulty and discouragement, the night seemed dark, and you felt like you might drown under all of it you're dealing with? Have you ever felt that way? And you might have called out to God for help like Peter, but the headwinds made you afraid and you felt like you were sinking. You know, I think we all have had experiences in life like that have caused headwinds and trouble for us, probably more than once. I know I certainly have. My sister likes to tell stories of when she has been in difficult situations and how she has gotten through them with faith and God's help, like the apostles today. There's one in particular I like. Just before the pandemic, she took a new job in a city a few hours away from where the family was living. Now, her husband had been on disability for years and was declining at that period, and she still had children in school and at home. So she herself decided she had to go back to school, get a master's degree, so she could get a new job and a better job in order to help support the family as the husband was declining, and the needs were still there. So she got the job, but it was in a city 2 hours away. She rented an apartment, brought the youngest child with her, and the dog, and tried to carry on. The eldest child stayed home in the other city, helping the father and working part-time. But as the pandemic hit, the father was weakening, and she realized that she needed to bring the family back together again to support one another, and especially to continue helping taking care of the father, the husband. The headwinds seemed to be increasing at all this time as she was trying to manage all of this and figure it all out. So she started looking for a house to buy. But if you remember, at that time and for a couple of years afterwards, houses were going for thousands of dollars above asking cost. And that she kept putting in a bid but lost every one of them. And so she became very discouraged. You know, that sinking feeling started to develop, she said. And she wondered if she should quit her job and return to take care of her husband, which was her major responsibility. But if she quit, it was going to be hard to make ends meet and that sort of thing. So she cried out to God like Peter, asking, "Which way do I go? What should I do? What are you asking of me?" She was desperate. Well, God came through in the past, she said, and so she was hoping he'd come through again. So she decided to try once more looking for a house. And this time, she went to the homes for sale by owner. And one of the first houses she saw, a new listing, happened to be the Airbnb she lived in for the first week she took that job. And so she immediately called the owners, and they were happy to work an agreement and sell her the house. And the house sale went through quickly. You know, for her, it was like in the gospel we just heard Jesus saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Take courage, it's I, do not be afraid. And so the family was reunited, and they were really able to care for the father and one another during the pandemic. He never got sick, and he made it through. When the apostles recognized that it was Jesus walking on the water, that it was not a ghost, their fear disappeared. And when he climbed into the boat with Peter, the storm lost its power to terrify them. When we trust in God's abiding presence in our life, difficult situations we encounter don't seem as impossible as they once did. they become easier to deal with. The apostles still had to reach the other shore in the middle of the night, and my sister still needed to engage a new job, take care of her husband, and finish raising her children. But knowing God was with her made what seemed like an impossible situation a more manageable one. I hope that many of you, too, when you look back at your life, can find times you trusted God, kept the faith, believed in his presence, and it made difficult situations easier and less fearful for you. Knowing and remembering such times can give us trust and hope that God will be there in the future as well, as it did for my sister. Sometimes, however, God's presence isn't obvious at first, is it? It's more like a gentle wind, which we heard about in the first reading. The prophet Elijah was running away from the king and queen of Judah. They had apostatized and turned to worship idols, not the living God. He challenged that, and so they wanted to kill him. He flees to find refuge in a far-off mountain and cave, seeking God's presence and protection. But he does not find God in the big signs we often look for, and in this case, in the Old Testament, were kind of natural signs. He didn't find God in a strong wind, in an earthquake, in a fierce fire, but in a tiny whispering sound, like a gentle breeze. It took a while for Elijah, the great prophet, to recognize God's presence in that gentleness, as it had for the apostles. Again, God was saying to Elijah, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." My sister has frequently commented to me that when she needed God at some crisis in her life, he always came through. She did not always recognize his presence right away or understand it at first. But when she paid attention to what the signs she saw him there, as when she continued to search for a house and finding the one in which she knew the sellers. Sometimes God makes presence known through a friend. It's not always a great event or a vision. It can be through a friend, sometimes through the beauty of creation, through a newborn child in the family, in moments of silence, or through scripture or prayer, or through not giving up, and so on. God is always communicating his love and presence. He's always in some way saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And he will use every means possible that we can perceive to hear this. The founder of the Congregation of Holy Cross, Blessed Basil Morel, heard it in a letter at a time of crisis in his life. Moreau was at a point where the congregation was growing but having a lot of problems: money, personnel, people in far-off missions succumbing to disease, and so many other things. He thought the whole thing might be collapsing. He was despondent for a while. He went to the chapel daily, spent a lot of time there praying. But one day he received a letter from a lady whom he knew and was a supporter of the congregation, but in a city far away, who he said there's no way she could have known what he was going through. He read the letter and he said, the letter began, "I see you in the same state as Peter when he was sinking in the water," like the gospel today. That's what she wrote to him. Father Moreau said, "In the twinkling of an eye, light flooded my soul and all my confidence returned. The trial was over." He had heard God, like Jesus said to the apostles, "Take courage, it's I, do not be afraid, move on." So when we are in the midst of trials and we find God hard to find, it's most important to continue seeking God, to share our troubles and our fears with God, and to be very, very, very attentive to the signs of his presence. God is always present. God always responds. And it's going to be something along the line, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." And our trust in that presence gives us courage instead of fear, makes what seems to be an impossible task more manageable. So you might reflect on these readings. Where in your life do you need to seek and trust in God's presence today?